Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. It is Thursday, September 22nd, 2015. This is probably one of my favorite topics to talk about because I think it is so universally misunderstood. It's such a strong contribution to the mental health and addiction issues that all of us are acquainted with, either because we see it in our loved one or because we experience some of it ourselves. I think it's the greatest barrier, this misunderstanding of guilt and shame and the role that it plays in our life. I think it's the biggest barrier to healthy and effective parenting. So with that, I'll get right into it and talk about it. First of all, from the book, guilt can undermine our confidence and erode our connection with our children, preventing us from allowing them to experience what they need to in order to stretch and grow. The first thing that I noticed about guilt when I became a therapist, specifically working with children and wilderness therapy and their parents, was how parental guilt for legitimate mistakes, legitimate issues, got in the way of parents holding their children accountable and allowing their children to struggle and suffer. And again, we'll talk about where that comes from tonight, but that's the first thought that I had when I was working with wilderness clients and I saw the parents and their interactions and the struggles that they had. So let's talk about guilt and shame. There is this idea, and people talk about it. I've heard it for years now. The guilt is feeling bad about something you do, and shame is feeling bad about who you are. Right? Maybe it's feeling bad about getting caught. Parents are always asking me about that. I got caught. It's about what others think about you. In fact, in one of her now famous TED Talks, Brene Brown talks about this. I make reference to this in the book. And she did so many wonderful things, but there's one piece that I think is slightly off the mark. When talking about guilt and shame, and she makes this comparison saying guilt is feeling bad for what you do and shame is feeling bad for who you are. She associates shame with mental health and addiction issues, and she associates guilt with health, with mental health, positively. And in fact, to illustrate this, she said, to the audience, she said, if you did something to hurt me and you felt guilty about it, how many of you, if I raise the hands, would come and apologize to me? And they pan to the audience, and all the hands in the audience go up. I make the joke sometimes that I'm not sure if any of these people are married because that's not always my first instinct, right? In my relationships is when I make a mistake and I feel sheepish or guilty about it. It's actually something I have to get past sometimes to go have authentic accountability with the person that I've hurt. In fact, I remember years ago when I had done something to my wife that upset her, hurt her, and I felt guilty about it. And I was looking down and feeling sheepish. She actually picked my chin up and said, look at me. I need you to be present with me. I don't want to have to take care of your guilt right now. So if we're going to get through this incident tonight, then I want you to be able to look at me. So guilt and shame prevent us often from doing the right thing. That is, the experience of guilt and shame is often the thing that causes us to do the wrong thing and that leads away from our awareness and our healing and our accountability. It's not always the case, but the most important point is that these are not reliable sources of morality, of good doing, of healthy living. Most parents will tell me when they acknowledge something they should have done, that would have been better for them to do for their child or for themselves, for their family. And I ask them, why didn't you do it? Often the answer is guilt. I felt guilty about it. So we first have to pull apart this idea that guilt and shame are going to give us some kind of moral direction. And even I think it's important to put back together this idea that guilt and shame, that they're not that separate. I think of them oftentimes as varying in levels of intensity. Right? Shame is an extreme desire to hide, to run away. And guilt, it looks more like a defense sometimes. Looks more like a lack of authenticity, a lack of connection, lack of intimacy in a relationship. Guilt is like a mild version of it. I talk about this idea that guilt is smoke and shame is the fire. How do you feel about it when people critique you or criticize you? How do you feel about exposing yourself? Even if it's only in your job or your art or the things that you do, how do you feel about that? Is it difficult? Are you worried about that kind of judgment, that kind of rejection? The effects of guilt and shame on awareness. That is precisely the thing that I think is most destructive about shame. If the distinction between guilt and shame is just a matter of degree, then we should all talk about the level of shame. Shame tells us that we are unacceptable, repulsive, and deserve rejection. The concept of healthy guilt is akin to saying that there can be healthy poison or humane cruelty. Guilt or shame based behavior negatively affects our emotional and spiritual life because it blocks us from achieving self awareness. And I use this story to illustrate this because I think everybody's familiar with it, whether they're Jewish, Christian, non denomination, secular, probably even Islamic faith is familiar with the story of Adam and Eve to some degree. From the story of Genesis, after an Adam and Eve transgressed by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they hid themselves from God. It goes on to say, and the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees in the garden. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee that thou wast naked? This story, doesn't matter your spiritual belief, the dogma that you associate with. This story is an illustration of what happens to us when we are told that we're unacceptable. Right? In this story, Adam and Eve's nakedness, their humanness, was, in their minds, they were convinced that it was thought to be something that God could not accept. And so they ran away from him. And that's a lot of what we talk about. That's a lot of what happens in therapy, is you come back into the presence of an other. In the case of a therapist, it's a therapist. And you practice. You take the risk to expose yourself. And hopefully, ideally, if the therapist is doing his or her job, they have a different reaction. They don't have a reaction that's anxious, a reaction that's frustrated, overwhelmed, intolerant. They just see you. And by providing you that reaction, you're more able, more inclined, more willing to look at it yourself. And that's what leads to healing and fixing it instead of simply symptom reduction. Shame and guilt are the forces that cause us to retreat from others, from help, and from needed support. We hide our humanness in the recesses of our unspoken selves, beyond the healing power of community. Exposing our whole selves to the light means a willingness to talk about and acknowledge it, and we need a safe context for that. A context where people won't recoil or shun. In attending therapy or a parent group, we can find people who accept us and our imperfections. An alcoholic walks into an AA meeting to expose his dirty secrets, and an old-timer says to him, You're welcome here. Sit next to me. That grace offers us the courage to look more honestly at ourselves. So when we think, in the case of our children or ourselves, that the solution to our symptoms is to dislike them, to be mad at them, to be angry with them, whether it's in the person of others or ourselves, if we think that, we're not likely going to embark on a path that's going to heal it. It's like cutting off a weed at the surface, right? You take away the symptom. It's like taking medicine for a headache when really the issue is you have a tumor. It's going to crop up somewhere else in the garden. The symptom is gone, but eventually the root cause, the root issue of it is going to manifest itself in some other way in our life. So it's important that we provide the opportunity, we develop greater capacity to listen, to hear, to be present, to deal with our anxiety, our frustration, our disappointment, our disgust at times. It's important that we develop that, and it's important that we find people, whether it's in AA or Al-Anon or parent support groups at Evoke or individual therapy, or somebody who has had similar experiences, therefore has lost the judgment. It's important that we find those people and we have a different experience so that we can begin to look at ourselves under the light of, under the warmth of that kind of grace. So is it a motivator? People, you've heard this phrase, you should be ashamed, or she has no shame, right? We have this idea that shame is going to keep people in line. And although it can have apparently short-term benefits, it is not adequate long-term fuel for change. That's why I see clients and students in our group in the first couple of weeks express incredible amounts of remorse and regret. And then weeks later, we see them demonstrating the same kinds of behaviors that they did prior to coming to Evoke. It's not that initial expression was not genuine, it's this, it doesn't lead to change, not long-term change. It can wake you up. It can cause you to ask yourself questions, right? But it can't lead you. I was just talking to some of our therapists in our supervision call that we do, where we talk about cases, but most importantly, we talk about our relationship to our clients and to the parents that we work with. And one of my therapists was saying that she thinks that one of the questions that she gets asked most often by parents is, is my child being sincere? Is my child being honest? Is this BS? And she said, I don't like this idea of thinking myself simply as a BS detector. I don't like that role, the role that I play being narrowed down to that. And what we talked about as a group was this idea that really what parents are asking is, will it last? Do you predict that this change, this expression has legs, that it's going to continue or endure? Or do you think it's shallow enough, temporary enough, that it's not going to last? Because all of us can resonate, can relate to an honest expression of ourselves, an honest emotional expression of some commitment that we make, and then later on struggle with that commitment. Right? All of us can relate to that. And would it be accurate to say that we were being insincere in our expression? I don't think so. I don't think that's what it's about. Right? I think it's something entirely different. Like I said, we assume that guilt is synonymous with a moral compass. One of the things that we talked about when we started Evoke, when we reorganized the companies of Entrada and Cascade, is that the debate about whether or not guilt is a reliable moral compass is over for us, right? We're not going to, with our clients, with our parents, use guilt to motivate them. We're going to try to extinguish or pull out of them that guilt so that they can heal. We're going to express with all of our clients and parents the utmost compassion. And through that compassion, like I described earlier, we believe that the parent or the child can have a greater capacity, can develop a greater capacity to look at themselves honestly, because there's no shame, there's no guilt. Harriet Lerner, and a lot of you have heard me quote her before. She's the one that wrote the book Dance of Anger, and I've done a webinar on it. It's one of my favorite books. And she makes this point very well in there when she talks about the anger and the resentment that people feel and how stuck they get. And she said, we're going to have to learn how to feel guilt and do the right thing anyway. I remember in my own therapy several years ago, I've been to therapy most of my life, and I was going through a particular challenge at this time in my life and my relationships, and I would have a wonderful session again, feel like I was found by my therapist, and then I would leave the session, and it wouldn't be long, even the drive home, before I would start to hear the noise in my head, hear the voices, feel the pressure, feel the pull, to not be authentic. And I realized it was a lot like guilt. I felt guilty for hurting other people. I felt guilty that what I might say, even if it was from a place of love and authenticity, could be experienced as painful. And that some of the decisions that I had to make or have to make every day that are healthy self-care might not take care of other people's needs in the way that they want to. And I would feel guilt because of that. And I realized, I remember exactly where I was in my car when I thought to myself, this is the work of therapy, right? The session is not the work. The session is a reference point. It's an anchor, right? It's something to look back on. But the real work in therapy is the space in between the sessions. And that goes to a question that parents often have about our program. They want the therapist to be there more often. The therapist is there a couple of days a week. And there's therapy going on every other day with the therapeutic field staff. And there's experiential and problem solving and relationship opportunities all week long. But it's important for me to explain also that space between the sessions becomes the rich work, becomes the time when clients and students can put it into practice. And that takes a lot of courage, a lot of tolerance for discomfort. Most importantly, if we parent our children using guilt and shame, we all do to some degree. So if that becomes one of the themes in our life with them, if that becomes something that we believe in, that we do with our children, we are creating a mechanism, and then they're not going to know right and wrong. They're going to believe that when somebody else is hurt or somebody else is upset with them, that they've done something wrong. And that's not necessarily true, right? We can think right now of examples where children make decisions that hurt their peers or make their peers feel uncomfortable or make their peers feel sad, and yet it's the right thing to do. I use the example of a young woman saying no to sex to her boyfriend. And all the same things that he might say to her in this hypothetical scenario are the same kinds of things that we say to our children when we're parenting them. I love you. This is hurting me. I care about you. Right? Don't do this. And if we create that mechanism, we're creating a vulnerability to peer pressure. And we're telling our children that our being hurt, our being upset, our being frustrated, our being angry, our being anxious, our being worried is evidence that they're doing something wrong. And it's not. It can be something that suggests that you ask yourself a question. But it can't be the driving force of right and wrong. In the book, and I have a webinar where I talk about the shame cycle, it simply illustrates this cycle that we go through. And we'll start at the top. There's a capacity in a child, in a person, a sensitivity, a capacity for empathy, an ability to perceive what other people are thinking and feeling and wanting. And then we focus on meeting their needs, right? And what happens is we start to get this sense of inflation that we are good because we're making the other person smile, making the other person happy, making the other person proud. And then we have this sense of, look how wonderful I am. I must be wonderful. I have made my parents proud. I have made my parents happy. But what we miss in that at times is the ability, the practice of taking care of our own needs in a healthy way. We don't know how to do that. And sometimes, depending upon the relationship, there's not a lot of tolerance for that. So we repress those needs, right? Don't be angry at your sister. Don't be jealous. Tell your Aunt Susie you love her. Give her a hug. Tell people that you're grateful when you get a present from them. All those kinds of things, right? So we don't have a safe place to express all of who we are. So we repress those needs. And then those needs are going to be hungry. They're going to get themselves met some way. So we start to meet those needs through maladaptive strategies. That could be drugs and alcohol. That could be cutting and depression. That could be isolation. That could be gaming, right? That could be other anxiety-solving behaviors. It could be all of that stuff. Right? We do that kind of thing. And then what happens is we start to have the experience even that others are forcing us to do this, right? My dad told me I had to play soccer. My parents wanted me to get straight A's, right? We have this belief that other people are forcing us to do it. And then we get more and more resentful. The maladaptive behaviors escalate. And then eventually there's this complete disconnection, this blow up. I don't care. I don't care what you, I'm going to do everything opposite of you. I don't value anything you value. I don't love you. And then we have a moment maybe where we get sent to revoke or we get a DUI, lose our job. Something happens. And then we feel this overwhelming guilt and deflation. I'm horrible. I'm bad. I see that happen with our clients and students all the time. That's why we have redone the impact letter instructions and the impact letter webinar, is to de-emphasize that it's about how upset your family is and to re-emphasize how you're hurting yourself, you're letting yourself down. And then we have the possibility just to go over and over in this. And so how do we get out of this cycle? The way out is out. The way out is to walk through our shame and our guilt and to realize that it's not ours, that it was given to us. It wasn't given to us intentionally, but it was given to us. And that we're, going to have to learn to tolerate it. So many people will ask, and there might even be webinar questions lining up. If not for feeling bad, why do anything good? I've told this story before, I'll tell it again. I was teaching a lesson one time in my community. And I was talking about guilt and shame. And I had an attorney ask me the question and tell a story where he said this question, if not for bad, if not for feeling bad, if not for feeling guilty, then why do anything good? Why do anything right? Why do anything moral? And he gave an example of the story where during law school he was asked to go to a prison to interview inmates. And he interviewed somebody who had committed murder for a couple of $100 holding up a convenience store. And the lawyer asked him the question, what did you do after you did that? And the inmate said, I just went back to my place and went to sleep. And he gave this illustration as the idea. See, there was no remorse, there was no guilt there, Brad. So why would we do anything right? And the answer that I came up with was love. We do it for love. We do it for connection. We do it because it brings us joy. We do it for compassion. And all of those words and terms I just used apply not just to my relationship with the other person, with my child, with my spouse, with my co-parent. They apply to how I feel about myself in the process, which in many ways has to come first. It's really the same thing, right? How I feel about myself and others, it's the same thing. There's no order to it. You can get to one through the other. You can get to a greater level of self by serving other people, and you'll get to wanting to serve other people the more healthy your relationship with yourself is. I remember when I was a kid, I must have been 10 years old, long before I ever dreamed of being a therapist. I remember listening to a talk show host, a radio talk show host, and I heard them describe the problem with most psychologists is that they want you to get rid of your guilt and your shame. And I remember being so afraid of that. If that's what psychologists do, these have got to be bad people, right? These amoral people. But what I'm talking about is a higher level of morality. It actually is real morality. And it's based on, like I said, love, authenticity, connection, compassion, respect, all of those things. It's not based on feeling bad, especially feeling bad because somebody else is hurt or uncomfortable or in pain. I give the example, I'll give the example more generically than I do in my own life, although it applies to my own life. What if you are a child and your mother or father joins a specific church and they think that you're going to hell if you don't join the same church or synagogue that they do? Are you going to change because of that? And it's sincere. They actually believe the choices you are or aren't making in this case are going to destroy not just your life here, but maybe for eternity. Of course you wouldn't necessarily join them, follow them. But it's the same kind of thinking. And so how do we teach our children what's right? How do we teach them how to know what is right? Love, connection, empathy, and want for something better are all more lasting motivators for change. And then for me, it's this. When somebody learns how to feel, when you learn how to authentically feel your feelings, to the extent you can, you recognize it in other people. And this is how we develop empathy, not by guilt, but by learning how to feel. I learned this principle when I was working with serious sex offenders years ago for the state of Utah. We had a contract with the state of Utah, this program that I worked at. And I learned that telling them horrible stories about how they affected their victims didn't do anything for them. Most of them were so absent of feeling because they had experienced significant and lasting and chronic trauma in their lives that they learned not to feel. And when one learns not to feel, that's how we imagine other people are, right? If I don't feel anything, if I don't feel hurt, I don't imagine you do either. And so when I'm hurting you, right? I don't imagine myself hurting you. It's like I'm not hurting a rock when I throw a rock at it. And so you're more like a thing because I've turned into a thing. So learning how to feel, that's the doorway. That's the path toward empathy and a lasting source of morality. Like I said, the early impacts, my early experiences with impact letters started to teach me right away that people could have profound experiences of guilt and shame and that didn't necessarily translate into any kind of lasting change. I've told the story a couple of times. Some of you have heard it about I was out in the girls group last summer, and she read an incredible impact letter that had a lot of stuff in it. Serious drugs, serious sexual acting out, stealing, disrespect of family. After she read the letter, in tears, sitting there in tears, one of her peers asked her, how are you feeling right now? And she said, I can't believe I feel so bad for all the things I put my parents through. And my response was, I think that's the least important thing in the letter. I think the most important thing in the letter is you've let yourself down and what you've put yourself through. Yes, you did hurt your parents. And yes, they care about you. And that can be an invitation for you to look at some stuff. But if that is your focus, then you're going to spend the time here trying to please them, trying to make them happy, trying to make them proud, trying to impress them. And you're going to lose the most important thing, which is a connection to yourself, your authentic self, and your healing, and addressing the wounds that are beneath the symptoms that they're describing. So it's critical that we understand that as we parent, we have this model and that we stop. We stop thinking that guilt and shame are going to be the answer to mental health and addiction issues. Talk about how guilt is the grape and resentment is the raisin. You know, eventually guilt is going to turn out to be resentment in many, many cases because we're doing it for other people. I can't live for you. And isn't that what we're doing? Most of us at our ages, you know, a lot of us are in our late 30s, 40s, 50s, right? Aren't we trying more and more to care less and less what people think about us? And that's not because we're becoming morally degraded, devolving. That's because we're developing a greater sense of morality and we're finding another source, our heart, right? Our heart is becoming more something we can listen to. Repression, defensiveness, and hiding the truth from ourselves is the effect of guilt. We may eventually numb ourselves because of chronic guilt or shame. That's an important thing. People who have no feeling toward others, no recognition of how they affect others, oftentimes have felt, not all the time, but many times have felt so overwhelmed by guilt and shame that they've turned it off because they can't tolerate it. It's too loud. A lot of times it's because they themselves have experienced significant and chronic trauma and learn not to feel and then project that onto others. But that can be a result. So when you see a child who has no shame, no guilt, no remorse, one of the questions you can ask yourself that we ask ourselves is, are they so overwhelmed by guilt that they have to completely change the station? They can't listen to it anymore. This idea of losing our moral compass, I think I've said enough about that. We're not going to lose our moral compass. We're actually going to gain it. Being good, this is another piece I've been talking about in the last couple of webinars, last couple of weeks. Being good is the enemy of progress, right? If I need to be good as a dad, as a husband, as a father, if I need to be good to feel okay, then I'm going to have a hard time looking at myself and being honest with myself and owning my stuff and being accountable and making amends, right? So we have to let go of being good. We have to let go of this idea. The effects of guilt and shame is we isolate ourselves. Like the story of Adam and Eve with the fig leaves and the hiding from God, we isolate ourselves from support. You know, in AA, some of you that know it, and in Al-Anon, in 12-step groups, the fourth and fifth step are writing a fearless moral inventory and then sharing it with at least one other person. That's the healing of it. There's some other steps after that, including making amends, and then the 10th step is doing that on a daily basis. But the middle part of the 12 steps is all about what I'm describing. It's all about coming to terms. In the context of Adam and Eve, it is showing up naked to God. And having the courage to do that at the risk that we're going to be laughed at, that we're going to be rejected. But then we find people, we find places where it's okay. Why does my child blame me for their problems? Parents express anger, disappointment, frustration, and even rage at the blame their children place on them. The mistake of applying cause and effect logic to parenting when our children struggle is one way we might teach them to blame us, right? So that guilt that we have about how they've turned out, the shame that we have about, even when parents say to me, 2 of my kids turned out great and 1 didn't, they're still making a case for themselves, right? Like, see, I'm not all bad. I did something right. When we do this work that I'm describing, that's not even in the equation. I've said this before, and I believe this. I don't know that I've ever heard a really great parent say that they're a great parent. I don't know that I hear good parents say, I'm a good parent. When I meet parents that say, I try, I make a lot of mistakes. I'm learning a lot. I'm better at some things now than I was before. I have a weakness in this area. My biggest problem is in this area. That's what a healthy, quote unquote, good parent sounds like. When our guilt robs us of the ability to hold our children accountable, right? My divorce, right? I yelled too much. I worked too much. I let my boyfriend, my girlfriend into their life and they weren't nice. Whatever it is. For real legitimate things that we have done or not done. When it robs us of our ability to hold them accountable, to be a boundary, to be firm, to be strong, when it prevents us from allowing them to struggle. We rob them of important and critical opportunities that build self-esteem. We essentially say, you're beyond, I mean, you've been so hurt, so injured, and you're so fragile that I can't hold you accountable. You're so weak, I can't hold you accountable. It's okay to have compassion. It's okay to be sensitive. It's okay to be empathic. It's also okay to have a boundary and to not let our compassion, our understanding, our recognition of things we have or haven't done rob us and them of an important process. Guilty parents teach blame and model narcissism. You can't be to blame. You can't blame yourself for everything that you do and then not blame your parents, right? It can't work that way. And so many of the parents that I work with will say, well, I'd never blame my parents. But then they're struggling and walking through their own blame and shame. See, the shift is I can be accountable without shame. I can say I make mistakes. I made one today. I made one yesterday. I'm going to make one later this evening. And I can recognize it and I can look at that and I can work on that. But it's not going to be debilitating to me. Sometimes it's this flooding technique. Sometimes I'll just overemphasize. That's why I use the idiot intervention with parents. Ask them to be an idiot. That's why I say some of the provocative things I say about how we screw up our kids sometimes. Just to erase the whole idea of us trying to get it perfect or right. That is going to get in the way of us getting it better. Um, Here's the take homes. Avoid the temptation to use guilt and shame to modify behavior. And it's not just the obvious. It's the sarcasm, right? It's the questions that aren't questions. Why did you do that? I can't believe you did that. Really? It's that kind of stuff. When we're telling them how we feel, so then they will change their behavior to make us feel better. I'm so upset. I'm so worried. I'm so disappointed. And you've seen it in their eyes. They just say, get away from me. And then our reaction, our belief is in that situation, they don't care. No, no. They're just trying to say, it's not my responsibility. Your happiness, your peace, your serenity, your anxiety, it's not my problem. That's your problem. I got my own problems over here. And if I got to take care of your self-esteem and your sense of well-being, that was your parents' job. Sorry they didn't take care of that. If I got to do that, I'm going to be so overwhelmed. I got enough problems on my own. Own your feelings. Talk about your feelings, but own them. And when I say own them, I'm not just saying say I feel and talk about, but make it your those of you, and I imagine there are a lot of you, and it's me. It's my work all the time. I have to go get my anxiety taken care of. I don't always vent to the person that I'm upset with. Not because I'm avoidant, but because sometimes I need to take care of that. That's my issue. If anxiety is debilitating me and my child has serious problems, and our children do have serious problems in this program, but I've got to manage my stuff, and that's my responsibility to take care of. Are you ashamed of this part in your journey? I think if all of us are honest, we'd say at times we are, right? We are ashamed, and we communicate that. You can talk about that. You can own it. You can admit it, and it's yours, and it's not theirs. You can even name it with them as they get older. Oh, I skipped one. Express and get clear with and of them. I worded that a funny way, but it just means you express yourself. But you express yourself to get through your emotions and to not put it on them and to own them. Parents will ask me, you know, what should I tell family members? I had a student one time who asked his parents, what are you telling family members? And they became all appalled. This was a parent-child phone call from the field. And they became very nervous and scared. No, we're just being general. We're just telling people you're away at school and all this stuff. And he said, wait a second. You don't need to say that. Are you embarrassed? And then they were afraid again and said, no, we're not embarrassed. We're not ashamed. He said, it sounds like it's okay. It sounds like you are. And I'm not. And you don't have to lie to them or beat around the bush. If you feel uncomfortable, you can do that, but I don't need you to do that. And if you are embarrassed, I hope you figure that out. I mean, that's a student. That was an adolescent boy talking to his parents. So we need to own. It's important for us to own and to work on that if that's true. And that's part of what this experience I think requires us to expand beyond the boundaries of our own family of origin, beyond the limits of what we thought was acceptable and okay. That's the part of the transformative process of being in this field as a therapist. I learned so much from the students, from the clients, from the families that I work with. I learned so much compassion. I learned non-judgment. I learned that people go to amazing places and face amazing things, are incredibly courageous about this process. And in that observation, I lose my judgment. I always like to think that our children are going to grow up in spite of us, right? They're gonna grow up. I had a parent one time, and I think I've told the story to you before. I had a parent who was she had been a little ways through this process, and she said that um, at first she thought that everything was her fault. She talked about the divorce, and it wasn't a very good divorce. Talked about some other things that she thought it was her fault. Then she went to her therapist, and her therapist said, "No, you're a good mother. It's not your fault." So then she felt okay. And then I stepped in and I said, "I don't think it has to be that. I think you can just realize you were very imperfect, very human, made lots of mistakes. And those mistakes have an impact on a child. The mistakes Brad Reedy, am still making today are having an impact on my child. And I know that. And so it's not, I'm a horrible parent or I'm a good parent. Convincing yourself you're a good parent, it's the same problem as thinking you're a bad parent. You're just human. You make mistakes. You're better than some and worse than others. And you got work to do. And there's stuff to learn, stuff to grow, skills and tools to develop, insight to develop. You have all of that. And you left an imprint on your child, both positive and negative, at varying degrees for all of us. And if you can think about, to the extent that we all can think about it the way that I'm talking about it right now, we can actually then be in a relationship with our children where they get to feel it and see it and take care of themselves. We don't get defensive. We can listen better. We can see them better because we're not so clouded by this need to be the good one. You're always doing the best you can and you can do better. Both of those are always true in all of us. Right? If we can hold on to those seemingly opposite ideas at the same time, we can get out of the shame cycle, out of the shame and guilt. And I end with the idea of idiot parent. If you can just accept that you're an idiot, and I mean that in the most loving way. If we can all just accept that we're an idiot, it's just my provocative way to just accept that we're human. If I can just accept to my children, I'm an idiot. I might be wrong. The debate is over. My need for them to take care of, to like, to agree with me is gone. It's actually incredibly respectful. And when I say I'm an idiot parent, I'm not talking in some kind of way where it's depressing and discouraging and I feel bad about myself. I feel great about myself when I recognize that I'm an idiot. That's my best work, when I recognize and get in touch with my own idiocy. All right, happy to do any live questions topic related, and then we'll go on to non-topic related questions. I'm curious to know if the kids later in life, as they become parents, experience a second wave of guilt and shame relating to being a parent themselves. Is this something we will have to go through as a family again? I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. Second wave of guilt and shame relating to being a parent themselves. I don't know. I mean, my goal with all of you, with all of your children, and with all of our therapists is that we remove as much guilt and shame from our lives as possible, right? So I'm hoping that, part of what happens when we become parents, and I'm sure this happened with you, is we have empathy. We have empathy for our parents. And hopefully, one of my biggest hopes in this world is that we can stop thinking that it's different now. Every generation of parents has convinced themselves as a generation that today it's different. Yes, there are differences. There's, of course, differences with technology today. They were saying the same thing about the printing press that they say about the internet. The exact same thing. They were saying the same thing about Elvis Presley that they now say about rap music. It is the bane, the destruction of our society and our values. So the reason I'm going off on that tangent is because I hope that there is an evolution. I believe that the clients students and parents who go through our process have an edge up on the people who never go through something like this. I believe that we have the potential to raise a more morally robust generation. But to do that, we have got to face our fear, to let go of our shame and guilt, and our fear that comes along with that, that we're going to just go into hedonistic chaos, anarchy. But if we replace that with love, connection, empathy, feeling, authenticity, all of those things, we have a chance. So I don't know. I don't know specifically. What is our role or value receiving and extending forgiveness and addressing guilt and shame issues? Well, your role is to forgive always, all the time. But you're not going to do that because you're human. And I always encourage parents that that they get to forgive at their own pace, that there's no obligation, but that you own it. Own it. That's all. I'm struggling to forgive. I'm still hurting. I got to figure that out. But don't put it on them. Forgiveness comes on the terms of the person who's been offended, not on the terms of the person who's done the offending. And as a therapist, I would not ask you to move through your guilt, excuse me, your forgiveness at any pace. If you were struggling and seemed to be stuck in a non-forgiving place, I would explore it. There would be something there. There'd be some wound, some hurt, some fear, and we would explore it. But you see, part of what therapy does, and that's why this goes back to that radio interview I heard when I was 10 years old or whatever, is we have a whole different idea of morality when we talk about this kind of philosophy. We stop talking about good and bad. We stop talking about right and wrong, and we start talking about hurt and defenses and wounds and symptoms. And so you look at somebody who's doing horrible things to other people and to him or herself, and what you know as a therapist is they're not bad or evil, because most therapists don't believe in bad or evil. They believe that that person is hurting and sick and symptomatic and maybe very difficult to reach even. But it takes it, we're not priests or rabbis, most of us, right? We're therapists. And so we work with healing, and we work with hurting, and we work with symptoms. So my answer to that is you go through, you own it, ideally own it. Own the forgiveness is yours. Don't put out this level they have to get to so that you can forgive them. You get to own it. You get to decide when you let it go. You get to decide at your pace. And if I'm accountable and I've hurt you, I don't try to sell you on anything. I don't need you to forgive me. I don't need you to move along toward forgiveness at any certain pace, right? If I'm accountable, I understand. I recognize. I look at myself. And I don't try to sell you on the fact that I'm trustworthy again. And so many parents get hung up on that idea that they need to forgive their children to give them self-esteem. You just got to own it as yours and not about them. And if they're accountable, they'll be okay with it. If they're not accountable, they're going to be very anxious and eager for you to forgive them. And they're going to believe that they need to be forgiven to feel okay. And that's not true. We try not to use guilt and shame and don't think we have done it often, but our daughter seems to be primed to feel guilty and ashamed about many things, even the slowness of her treatment process. How can we communicate to her that we don't blame her or think she should feel guilty? Don't use the word should. Eradicate that from your vocabulary. I'll answer this in a couple of ways. Instead of telling what she should do, see, let me do this. Let me try this with you. And I don't know you, so if it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. Instead of instead of saying she's having this problem that she feels ashamed and guilty and can't let go of it, and she's even beating herself up over the slowness of her treatment process, instead of you needing it to be different, just embrace it and replace your concern and your anxiety about this with curiosity. I'm curious. What does that do for you? Where did that come from? I'll say to people often, if you want to know how I feel, I'll tell you. I had a colleague sharing with me recently about some anxiety and depression that he was dealing with, and he was beating himself up for it. He's a friend of mine. And I said, without trying to remove, I said, you want me to tell you my experience of being around you when you're depressed and anxious? I'm okay with it. I'm worried about it for you because it seems really unpleasant, but I don't need you to be different. I don't need you to be not anxious or quicker. So you can talk about your experience, right? Just talk about, I, I don't, I don't need a certain pace. Looks like you're struggling. I have compassion. I care. I'm sad that you're sad, but I don't need you to get better. I would want you to because I think you might be happier, but I'm not sure that beating you up or us being mad at you or upset or impatient with you would help anyway. And if I was that way, that'd be about me anyway. See, children like this have this extra sensitivity. It's almost like their antenna are so sensitive that they're hearing everything from everybody all the time and about what is expected with them. So the best thing you can do is let go of your attachments and expectations of them. Name it, communicate it. Ask them if it's okay that you share. And then even let go of your attachment of them getting beyond it and figuring, run into it, not away from it. Right? Concentrate on it and embrace it rather than trying to get it to go away. So own it, name it, ask them if they're okay, tell them how you feel, and then be curious instead of anxious or instead of frustrated or impatient. Even if that frustration and impatience and anxiety is connected to your care and love for them, they've got to know that it'd be ideal for them to experience that their healing, their progress, or lack of it is not causing you pain or happiness. Does that make, I mean, that sounds almost crazy. I know, but it's true. Do you find guilt and shame is greater in southern state families? Huh, that's a good question. It's different, I think. It's different in different parts of the country and different cultures, and there's a certain there's a certain thing about southern families that they don't like to air their dirty laundry. And people from Southern California, where I grew up, they're more comfortable with their dirty laundry. But there's different kinds of guilt and shame. There's religious flavors to certain kinds of guilt and shame. Other, New York City or Southern California, Los Angeles, they might be ashamed of different things, right? Where I grew up in Southern California, there wouldn't be a lot of shame about going to therapy as much as there would maybe in Alabama. But you better believe that what kind of car you drive is important in Southern California. Look at the cars that are driving around Southern California, and how you look is important. So there's shame there. So it has a different style. And definitely, I had an experience. People from England don't like to talk about their feelings, and these are generalities again. You see trends in different cultures, even different parts of the country, different religions. I see my daughter live her life through the prism of guilt and shame. It is painful to watch. What can I do to support her in getting past that and find self acceptance within? I know my job is so limited in helping her to heal. I mean, I like that last part that you say because, there's a lot more of what we maybe don't do that will be helpful than what we do do. You know, I think the best thing that you can do, all of you can do to help your children is to work on your shame and guilt, to work on yourself. If they know that they're not the only ones that are struggling, if they know that they're not the only ones that don't have all the answers, if they know that you're making your life your project and instead of their life being your only project, that's really helpful. So show up vulnerable, go to therapy, go to an Al-Anon meeting, walk into places that feel uncomfortable. Come to our parenting intensives, our individual intensive, stretch yourself in that way, and then talk to her about how hard it was. Because this is hard stuff. So make your life your project, do your own work. Tell her that you're even struggling with letting go. It's hard to watch. And sometimes I lack the capacity to watch at close range. But that's because of me. I just it's so ironic because talk about you, your struggles, your journey, your work, your activities, what you are doing, what you're not doing, what you're doing well, what you're not doing well to improve your life, all those things. What you don't know, what answers you haven't figured out. Give examples of times where you care what people think about you. Give examples where you care about peer pressure, where you care about fitting in or, measuring up to the Joneses. Do all of that stuff. Give her a problem that you haven't solved yet. Those are wonderful. To be vulnerable is the best way to be safe for her. And and then try to embrace her journey. Try to let your anxiety and discomfort of it be something you manage, not something that she has to manage or that gets communicated to her. It's not an expression of your love, not after it's said once or twice. It's just pressure. It's just another thing that she's doing to hurt people that love her more than anybody in the world. And it's just another burden. And make that your burden. The greater the capacity that we develop in this process, the more we can be present with other people's pain, the more that we can listen, the more we can approach them with a kind, compassion, dear one attitude. These are the 6 meetings. Go to 6 meetings while your children are with us. At least that's the minimum we ask. Follow us on social media. We have some exciting things coming up, including I just did an interview today with Lon Woodbury, and we're going to be talking about the wilderness play that we've been helping to support come out and helping to support produce. So there's going to be a large reading and fundraiser in New York City. I'm going to speak there in November. There'll be announcements here. So you can also email wilderness@evoketherapy.com to find out more about the play. And then it's going to tour the country next year. So here's the book. You can get on Amazon. You can also get audio versions of it through Audible on Amazon or a CD purchase. If you go to the Parent Alumni Foundation page, 10% goes to charity for people who can't afford treatment. Our upcoming parent support groups that we have on the calendar, a couple in New York City are already on the calendar. There's the information there, September 27th and October 25th. When I come out in November, I'll also do the parent meeting in New York at that time. I'm going to be in Seattle this Sunday from 4 to 6 p.m. And of course, Stephanie at Evoke Therapy. We have the upcoming, we would like all parents who possibly can to come to the workshop. It's a couple of days experiential and psychoeducational. And then the more intense work, this is the Finding You version. We have 3 different intensives. And this is one with, you don't have to, you can be a young adult. We're going to have at least 3 young adults there. There might be more. So we're going to have young adults there. And we're going to have all adults there. But because it's not necessarily a parenting thing, although if that's the theme that you come with, then we're going to work on that. But everybody's themes are going to be their own. If you want to find out more about our high adventure trips, go to the website and look under our pursuits. And then any questions, there's the next webinar, and then any other questions, Stephanie, I'm happy to take any off-topic questions. I can't find the exact quote right now, but I read something on a blog about a parent saying, we lose trust in bucket fills and earn it back in teaspoons. And it had something about the kids learning it that may take this to reconnect with their friends and family. Can you elaborate? I've heard things like this. I don't know that quote exactly, but I think sometimes I don't want your children to pay attention to how much you trust them or not. They end up focusing on selling something to you or impressing you. And I do want them to understand that you can lose trust. You can hurt people. You can lose reputation in an instant, right? And then it takes a while for people to trust again. I want them to understand that principle, but I also don't want them to be so overwhelmed by it that they feel guilty and ashamed. And I also don't want them, I'll say to them, I might not trust you. Your parents might not trust you anytime soon. So now what are you going to do? Is that the only reason you were working was to earn our trust back? Or were you working because you wanted to have a better life? You wanted to heal. You wanted to heal and recover from your addiction. You wanted to deal with your depression, your cutting, your anxiety, your rage, your anger, whatever it is. So I think it's important to be careful. We can teach children, people, about trust and losing it, and reputation and losing it, and how hard it is to earn back. But if we ask for that to be the emphasis, and I see this with our clients, they just focus on how other people see them. They just focus on whether or not they are trusted. They don't focus on being honest. See, I want them to focus on being honest, not being trusted. I have control over whether I'm honest or authentic. I don't have control whether you trust me or not. I have control whether I'm being sincere and genuine in my recovery, in my remorse, in my amends. I don't have control whether you forgive me or trust me. So I think there's an important line there that we stay away from and stop trying to use this information like this one here to try to put a lot of pressure on them. We just want them to find themselves and be honest and tell the truth and be authentic and sincere. And whether or not anybody trusts them or not, it's not their business. I think that's it. All right, I think that. Oh, one more question. It's taking a while for them to queue it up. I find I'm going through a mental crash. I've overread, overthought, and overreacted. What do you recommend for a parent that feels overwhelmed by information and different perspectives? My therapist tells me to go stare at the wall. That's what she says to me all the time. You need to go home and stare at the wall. You might imagine that I have had some of that same problem in my life. So I like to watch sports. I like to hang out with friends. I like to travel and go to nice restaurants. I like to run and exercise, get a massage. So you need, we all need to feed ourselves. And sometimes feeding ourselves is some of this information. But sometimes it's just getting away and being what people might consider as selfish. It's not. Selfish is just a word we use to try to shame people when our needs aren't getting met. I didn't even talk about that tonight, so I'm glad that that came up just now. But be selfish, be self-centered, take care of yourself, and it doesn't have to be a self-help book or a finding you intensive. It can be staring at the wall or binge watching an episode, some show on Netflix. Right? Be unproductive. That's what I would suggest. Take a therapy vacation, and that's an order. All right, guys. I will talk to you Thursday evening. I'll be back on perspectives and expectations. That'll be this Thursday, September 24th, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. So see you. Oh, I'm sorry, Stephanie. That's wrong. It's 7 p.m. Mountain Time. It's 7 p.m. Mountain Time on Thursday evening. I wrote that wrong. I apologize. 7 p.m. Mountain Time this Thursday, the 24th. All right. Take care, and I'll see you then. Bye bye.